Hi everyone, this is Mr. Zirkle and this video is about biodiversity. As we move through this course, we'll study the way humans have altered the natural world. One way for us to measure and quantify our impact is to look at something called biodiversity. Biodiversity or biological diversity is simply put the variety of life on Earth. This is why it's an important factor for us to look at when we assess our impact on the planet. We can look back 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, and we can compare the variety of life that exists today versus what existed in another point in time. Biodiversity exists on three levels. There's species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecosystem or habitat diversity. Let's begin by talking about genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the variety of genes found in a population or species. Each organism is unique in its genetic makeup. Take these two fish, for example. Even though they are the same species, their genetic characteristics or their genes may vary slightly. They may be slightly different sizes or colors, like these two. One may be more resistant to a certain disease than another. And human beings serve as a great example of this. We all belong to the same species, but we're all very different. If we look at all of the individuals in a population, we have a lot of different genes to consider. Collectively, these are known as the gene pool, the collective set of genetic information within a population of a given species. The larger the gene pool, the larger the genetic diversity. A larger gene pool means that when the environment is stressed for some reason, say with high temperatures or low oxygen or pollution, that there is a greater possibility that at least some members of the population will survive. In other words, there is a greater chance that some of the individuals possess traits that will give them a better shot at surviving things like disease, pollution, or high temperatures. These traits then will be passed on to their offspring. Sometimes, however, an event occurs which causes a population or a species to become drastically reduced in size. This in turn results in a much lower genetic diversity, and a much lower genetic diversity can cause inbreeding or reduction in the size of the population even further, since the individuals may be more susceptible to things like disease or climate change. Elephant seals, cheetahs, and the American bison, and even human beings are thought to have gone through genetic bottlenecking at some point in their history. It worked out for these species, but it doesn't always. In some cases, the lack of genetic diversity causes extinction. The second component of biodiversity that we want to look at is species diversity. Species diversity is the number and abundance of different kinds of species living in an ecosystem. Now, at first, this might sound pretty simple. You might think, when looking at two ecosystems, which one has more different kinds of species? However, species diversity has two different components: species richness and species evenness. Species richness is the number of different kinds of species that exist in an ecosystem. For example, take a look at the two communities shown below. Take a moment, pause the video, and I want you to count the number of different species in each community. So go ahead and pause now and count those different species. If you've done this, you'll find that in Community 1, there are 7 different types of species, and in Community 2, there are 4 different types of species. Community 1, therefore, has a higher species richness than Community 2. However, this really doesn't tell us anything about how many members of each species are present. Here we turn to something called species evenness, or the relative abundance of each species present. If you take a look at these two communities again, and if this time you count up the number of members of each species, you'll find that Community 2 is a bit more even than Community 1. As it turns out, ecosystems that have a high species richness, such as the rainforest, also tend to have high species evenness as well. Ecosystems that have a high species diversity tend to be more likely to recover from disruptions, such as disease, fire, or climate change. Species diversity can be measured using several indices. Both the Shannon-Weiner index and the Simpson index take into account species richness and species evenness. We'll take a look at these in class and work with these equations as well. One last thing you should know about species diversity is that it's highest in the tropics and lower as you move towards the pole. This is called the latitudinal diversity gradient. Now, the last component of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity, and it refers to Earth's diversity of biological communities or ecosystems. We've talked about desert biomes, and you know that deserts receive little rainfall, and they can be either hot or cold. But think about the different types of desert. There's the Sahara Desert in Africa. There's the Mojave Desert in the southwestern United States, and there's the Gobi Desert in Central Asia, which can sometimes see snow. All of these deserts are different, and they support different species of plants and animals. But just because they're all the same type of biome doesn't mean that the same species of plants and animals live there. However, the structure of these ecosystems is the same. For example, they all contain plants and animals with adaptations to dry conditions. They also don't contain many large animals. So, taken together, species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity make up what we call biodiversity. And remember, biodiversity is a factor that we can use to assess our impact on the planet. In fact, there's one last thing we want to talk about in relation to biodiversity, and that's how humans are impacting the natural world in drastic ways. We know that many ecosystems and species are under threat. We don't, however, have the resources to save all of them at the same time. So scientists have determined areas of the world where we need to concentrate our efforts to conserve and protect the natural world. These areas are called biodiversity hotspots. Now, how do scientists determine which areas are most in need of our help? Well, in order to be considered a biodiversity hotspot, there are two requirements that need to be met. First is that it must contain 1,500 species of plants that are endemic to that region, which really means that those plants can only be found in that specific location and nowhere else. The second criterion is that it must have lost more than 70% of its native vegetation. So, what regions have been designated as hotspots? Well, there are currently 36 designated hotspots, many of which are in tropical forests. They cover about 2.4% of Earth's land surface, and collectively, they contain about 50% of all of the world's endemic plants and 42% of all terrestrial vertebrates. These locations are ones that scientists have designated as needing our help and which they believe we must protect at all costs. All right, well, that's the lesson on biodiversity. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in class.